Mr. Botany here with our next botany lesson on plant growth requirements. So let's get right into it here. So these are the things that a plant needs in order for it to grow and in order for it to be able to live. First and foremost, it needs to have the right temperatures. And so what I'm looking for here is I'm looking for a range in which a plant is going to be successful to grow within. And that allows them to have all of their chemical reactions and process happen at the right rate. Plants, of course, need light in order to do photosynthesis. They need moisture, or water in this case. Plants need carbon dioxide, a steady supply of that. And then they need some other essential nutrients that they can find and pull from within their environment. So more on each of those, and we'll get started first off with, again, talking about temperature. Now, really, plants are just a type of living thing, and all living things need to operate within a specific temperature range. Really, plants, as well as I mentioned, all other living things, are just a big blob of chemicals that they interact in the right way. They do the right types of chemical reactions to provide life. Well, living things rely heavily on a category of proteins called enzymes. Now, these enzymes allow chemical reactions to take place at a rate and happen in times when otherwise they normally wouldn't. Photosynthesis is a big portion of this. It relies heavily upon some enzymes and some things within it in order for it to happen. Because really, if you look at what's combining carbon dioxide and water, two everyday chemical compounds that would never react and interact on their own to make glucose and oxygen. They never would. So the right temperature allows reactions to take place in order for these living things to, well, survive. We could get a little bit more specific in that, and we could say that certain plants require a certain temperature range in order for them to be successful, right? Like I've already mentioned to you, most evergreens. Most conifers live in places where the temperature's cooler, so they're going to want a cooler temperature range all the time. They'll be more successful there. Whereas some plants, like tropical plants, would like the temperature range to be warmer because that's what they're adjusted to. As I mentioned, typically higher temperature ranges means that chemical reactions will proceed at a faster rate, and therefore the growing of that organism will be faster. So as we see, tropical rainforests where the temperature is higher, you have a larger diversity and faster growth for those plants. This image here is pretty good because it shows that this plant has a range that is most successful in. You can tell somewhere between 68 and 77 degrees Fahrenheit is really where this plant is the most happy. Even up to 86, but you get hotter than that and the plant starts to decline. Much cooler than that, again, the plant also will decline. So this is the idea that the right temperature range is essential for a plant to be able to survive. This graph here is interesting because it shows many of the common plants that we grow here in the United States and Michigan with a couple points on it. The green points are the practical temperature for if you were planting a seedling into the ground. And then the black dots are if you were to put the actual seeds as opposed to a seedling and looking at the differences between those. It's interesting to note that all of these plants, the seed germination, that's when a seed will sprout, is much higher than what if you actually had an established plant. If you have an established plant, it can survive the temperature ranges better. The seeds require these specific temperatures in order for them to sprout. Very useful information for anyone who's growing plants for production of food like farmers. Light, obviously another essential component for plants. And there's a couple things that we're looking at when we talk about light for plants. The intensity, so how bright it is. The duration, so the amount of light. And then the quality. And what I mean by that is what is contained within the spectrum of light. So first let's talk about the quality. Normal plants grow under sunlight, right, which contains all of the spectrum of light that plants need in order to survive. There's all the correct frequency and wavelength of light. If you were to grow a plant inside, though, to use artificial light, this was something you would need to take into account. You wouldn't use a typical incandescent light bulb to grow a plant with because it doesn't have all of the required frequencies of light. Other types of grow lights will be able to cover those frequencies much better, and you'll have much better results. The duration of light is the amount of time that a plant gets light during a day. Right now, this is determined by the amount of sunlight. So again, we're talking about plants that live outside. They're subject to then, well, how far away are they from the equator, right? The closer you are to the equator, the more consistent that you have of sunlight. If you're right on the equator, you get about 12 hours of sunlight and 12 hours of darkness each day. You move away from that, though, south or north, and then you get your seasons, where you're in the summer, you'll have more daylight, and in the winter, you'll have less daylight. Photoperiodism, and more on this in a moment, is a plant's response to the amount of daylight. Now let's take a look at photoperiodism. One of the main things that we look at is a flowering response in terms of the amount of sunlight. A short day flowering plant will flower in response to sunlight of less than 12 hours. These would be plants like the ones that flower specifically in the spring, early in the spring, more specifically, before we've made it to the solstice, or the equinox, where we have 12 hours of light and 12 hours of darkness. So in this case, like tulips that flower very early in the spring would be short day flowering plants. Long day flowering plants would be ones that flower when the amount of sunlight is greater than, say, 14 hours, like sunflowers. These flower middle of the summer or towards the later parts of summer, where the amount of sunlight, especially here in Michigan, is well over 14 hours a day. Day neutral plants are ones that the amount of sunlight doesn't really affect whether they flower or not, like dandelions. You can find dandelions sprouting people's lawns all summer long, all growing season long. They simply don't care how much light there is. So there are genes within a plant that can get turned on or off depending upon the amount of sunlight. Those genes then trigger the production of flowers and therefore the flowering process. This is an interesting graph here because what it shows is we've got two columns. We've got the short day plants in this column here and the long day plants in this column, with the pie graph showing the amount of light. So in this first one, we've got quite a bit of light and very little darkness. So the short day flowering plant would not flower in this case, and the long day flowering plant would. The exact opposite is in this case. We've got a lot of darkness and very little light, so the short day flowering plant will flower and the long day will not. This last one is interesting because we have the same general amount of light. We've got just a little bit of sunlight, mostly darkness, but there's this interruption right here where some artificial light was applied to the plants in the middle of the night. And notice what it did to the flowering. It did the exact opposite. Now, the short day plant is no longer flowering and the long day plant is. This is a helpful piece of information that farmers or anyone can use really if they're looking to augment when a plant flowers or when it doesn't flower. Ultimately, the flowering of plants determined by the amount of sunlight is a useful feature for plants. If all plants flowered at the exact same time, there would be way too much competition for pollinators, right? If every single plant opened at the same exact time, let's say first thing in the spring, the bees and the birds and the moths, they would go crazy because there'd be a lot of food everywhere, but what would the likelihood be that they were able to visit multiple flowers of the same species? It would go down because there'd be so many flowers available all at once. So the likelihood of any specific flower being pollinated and then therefore being able to produce its seeds would go drastically down. Plus, then this gives those organisms, those pollinators, a food source throughout the entire growing season, throughout the entire summer, as opposed to just one period of time. So by staggering when plants flower, it increases their likelihood of being pollinated and provides a food source all summer long for the pollinators. Another thing that we can talk about is the intensity of light. Now, again, if you're talking about a plant growing outside, there's really not much to do to change the intensity. But if we're talking about a plant that we're growing inside, by moving the light source closer or further away from the plant, we can change the intensity. The closer the light is to the plant, the more intense the light, and then therefore the faster the rate of photosynthesis. However, the faster the rate of photosynthesis, the faster the consumption of water, which is something we would definitely have to take into account. The amount of water applied to those plants would then have to be increased to be able to sustain the amount of photosynthesis. Right? The further away you move the light away from the plant, the slower or the less photosynthesis that would then take place. Phototropism is a really unique property of plants where they will tend to lean or grow in the direction of a light source. This next image here shows some radish seedlings growing in response in direction to a light source. It starts off over on the left and the light is switched over to the right, and notice how the plants shift in their direction as they grow. Of course, this is a time lapse here, so this is not happening this fast, right? This is taken over the course of a day or so, but it's a really unique and interesting property for plants to be able to increase their intensity of light by growing in the direction of the light source, again called phototropism. Moisture, of course, obviously a very important thing for plants, and this is water. Water is a very essential solvent for living things. What I mean by that is that many other chemical compounds are dissolved within water and then can be used to carry around that organism. So things that will be dissolved inside of a plant will be salts and nutrients and sugars, and they can be then carried throughout the whole body of the plant through that water. Water is also used in the process of photosynthesis. It's one of two main reactants of photosynthesis, the other being carbon dioxide. But without water, plants cannot do photosynthesis. No photosynthesis means no production of oxygen, and no production, most importantly for the plant, of glucose, which is its food. Another thing that's important and that's just what I mentioned there, and then another thing is that the water helps to control the temperature of the plant. Water, as we've seen in some of our chemistry courses, has a high specific heat capacity. What that means is it's difficult to heat up or to cool down water. It likes to stay the temperature that it's at. This is again key for living things like ourselves and plants that are primarily made of water. This keeps them within that specific temperature range that they want to be able to do their chemical reactions. Proteins, if they get too hot or too cold, tend to unfold. It's called denaturing. When they unfold, they can no longer do their chemical reactions and then therefore are useless. Water works great as a building material because, again, it's hard to heat up and it's hard to cool down. If you've ever tried to warm up a pot of water on the stove, you've noticed this before. Under direct flame, it takes a long time for water to change its temperature. It has everything to do with its chemistry and its hydrogen bonds that are inside of it. But moisture is essential for controlling the temperature of plants. This image is great. If we take a look over on the left here, we see a tree drawing water up through its roots, into its stem, and then out through its leaves, and then eventually out into the atmosphere again. All of this is done through the action of vascular tissue, which is shown in, zoomed in on the right. Vascular tissue, in this case being xylem, is responsible for moving water throughout the body of the plant, and it can move it against gravity, and in fact, very far against gravity in the cases of trees. So it gets drawn in through the roots, and this happens primarily through osmosis, and then up into the stem and then to the leaves. The leaves then use the water to do photosynthesis, but not all of it is used there. Some of it will actually evaporate out into the atmosphere and leave pores in the leaves called stomata. This process is called transpiration, and what it does is it creates a concentration gradient. And a concentration gradient basically just says that through the evaporation of water in the leaves, there will then be less water in the leaves and then more water down in the ground and the roots. Water will always move from an area where there's a lot of it to an area where there's not a lot of it. So through the evaporation out, we're creating a low concentration in the leaves and a high concentration in the soil. Therefore, water will continue to move up into the leaves. We have a constant flow of water up. The zoomed in image over here is showing one vessel of the xylem. Now there will be millions of these vessels inside of the wood. The wood really of the tree is essentially like a bunch of microscopic straws in order for it to draw that water up in and against gravity. Carbon dioxide is our next essential thing that plants need in order to grow, and it is, first and foremost, it is used for photosynthesis. Here's the reaction spelled out for photosynthesis: carbon dioxide plus water in the presence of light to produce glucose and oxygen. And this reaction cannot proceed without carbon dioxide. In fact, carbon dioxide is the source of the carbon that we find that's made in glucose. Notice how we have a carbon right here, and that carbon then shows up to produce the glucose here. Plants then use the products of photosynthesis for pretty much everything. Plant cells are primarily made out of carbohydrates that are rearranged forms of glucose. So every bit of mass, for the most part, that makes up a plant ultimately comes from carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which is really incredible. Most of the mass of a plant is not drawn up through the soil. It's taken in through the air, through the stomata in plant leaves, which is the next thing I wanted to show you here. The carbon dioxide gets into the plant not through the roots, but through the leaves themselves. Specifically on the bottom side of the leaves, there are these pores or openings that are called stomata, and they are opened and closed in response to water pressure by these cells called guard cells. More on that later. Air in the atmosphere contains about 0.04% carbon dioxide, which doesn't seem like much. In fact, let's take a look at the overall percentages of all gases in the atmosphere. Most of the gas in the atmosphere is nitrogen at close to 80%, and then we're at about 21% of oxygen. So we're looking at about 99% of all of the gases in the atmosphere are made up of these two gases. And this tiny sliver of 1% then composes of all of these other ones, and the one that we care about the most is carbon dioxide. In this case, it's very close to 0.04%. That's a number that's actually gone up quite a bit in recent years. This graph here shows the overall trend of amount of carbon dioxide in parts per million in the atmosphere. Notice that since 1880, it has risen and risen steadily to the rate we're at now. The other component to take a look at in this image is the blue and red bars that appear on it. And the blue and red bars are differences in temperature now as opposed to what the temperature was 100 years ago. So if it's a blue bar, that means that the temperatures during that time frame were colder than it was 100 years ago. If it's a red bar, that means that the temperature is hotter now at the same time 100 years ago. So as you can see, as the amount of carbon dioxide has increased, the overall temperature has also increased in comparison to 100 years ago. So as the amount of CO2 goes up, temperature also goes up. This is the global or the greenhouse gas effect. This is actually pretty good for plants since plants rely upon carbon dioxide for photosynthesis. The more CO2, the more photosynthesis they can do. However, it's not overall good for the entire Earth and for all living things, because as the temperature changes, living things need to change in order to keep up with it as well. If they don't evolve or adapt fast enough, they might not be able to survive in their new living environments. And plus, we're seeing tremendous habitat change in growing environments as the temperature increases as well. Essential nutrients are another thing that we take a look at when we talk about what plants need in order to survive. And these three here, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, are really the most important ones. Nitrogen is used in the production of chlorophyll, which is the green pigment that we find inside of plant cells that's ultimately responsible for absorbing sunlight. So the more nitrogen the plant has, the more chlorophyll it can make, the more sunlight it can absorb, the more photosynthesis it can do. Phosphorus is primarily used in root development, but it's also one of the major chemical components of ATP, adenosine triphosphate, which is essentially like chemical energy currency for every cell of every living thing. Incredibly important in that regard. Finally, potassium is used in the opening and closing of stomata, as we can see here in this image, that the amount of potassium can trigger the opening or closing so that water can evaporate out through transpiration, but we can also get that gas exchange of carbon dioxide and oxygen in and out of the plant leaves. These three, in fact, are the three chemical compounds that you'll find inside of a fertilizer if you were to go to any garden center, a Home Depot or a Lowe's and buy a bag of fertilizer. There'll be three numbers printed on it, and there are always the amount of nitrogen, the amount of phosphorus, and the amount of potassium in it. So if your grass was, say, very yellow, you would want to choose a fertilizer that's high in nitrogen in order to get it to produce more chlorophyll, therefore having high amounts of nitrogen. Some other nutrients that we find are some of these secondary and trace elements are things, again, that are certainly essential to the functionality of plants. Don't need to get into much detail on these right now. More on those later. So in closing, the things that plants need in order to survive is they need the correct temperature in order for their chemical reactions to take place and so that they can survive in the environments that they're in. They need light to power photosynthesis. They need water in order to, again, for a reactant for photosynthesis, but also to help control their temperature. They need carbon dioxide as a reactant for photosynthesis. And then finally, they need some essential nutrients in their environment. Thank you for watching.